Welcome back, everybody. And next on the show this evening is Dr. William Rousen, Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, where Washington and Lee has become the most recent school to be swept up in this rise of racial tension sweeping across colleges all across the country.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
Good to see you. It's good to have you here, Dr. Rousen. As many members of the audience will know, colleges such as, most notably, Missouri, Amherst, and Yale have recently seen spikes in outbursts of racial tension in the past few months. Members of the Washington and Lee community have recently begun to discuss a development in the history of the school's endowment.
That's correct.
Now I think I have the gist of the story. An Irish farmer by the name of John Robinson lived on about 1,000 acres of land, which is now Buena Vista. In his will, he left his entire estate and all of his slaves to Washington College, now known as Washington and Lee University. This sum of money was said to be comparable to that of Washington's canal stock. The slaves were supposed to work on the land for 50 years after his death, but instead they were sold. That money was then used to fund the school in various projects. Now the question is, if the students of Washington and Lee understand themselves as beneficiaries of Washington's canal stock, are they also beneficiaries of the sale of these human beings?
Well, that's an excellent question, Tyler. You see, as a result of this controversy, the discussion of race has become extremely prevalent around Lexington. Students at the school have held multiple demonstrations. The school's president, Kenneth Ruscio, has endorsed the investigation and promotion of African American history and the impact that African Americans have had on the success of the school. Also, the surrounding area, which has historically experienced relatively high level of racism, even in the present day. Many people living in Southwest Virginia have taken to local news stations and social media, among other mediums, to voice their often sickeningly racist opinion following the recent developments at W&L.
You know, I am in no way an expert on the topic of race, as complex and controversial as it is. However, it seems to me that this question doesn't really make much sense. I mean, why do students care about whether or not they should think about Robinson's donation as equally important as Washington's? Is it really a matter of race? It seems to me that the school has already taken the right steps in dealing with the issue. By beginning to publicize the impact of Robinson's gift and recognizing the impact of African American members of the university have had, the university has obviously begun to take some steps towards rectifying the situation. What more do students want?
Well, the issue lies in the very implications of the term race. And what I mean by that is that when you discuss racism in a society, you have to understand it as a social construction.
Okay, and what do you mean by social construction?
Well, you see, when anthropologists say that race is a social construction, what they mean is that it does not make sense to create variations based on race, because race is not a biological variation between humans. So, whereas race is not biologically a real thing, it has been constructed into a factor within society, and an extremely impactful one at that. You see, the American Anthropological Association has published a very useful webpage on their Understanding Race website. The Race and Human Variation page explains that traditional race concepts give an inaccurate picture of human variation. The picture is inaccurate because these concepts suggest that each group has a significant level of uniqueness. However, the genetic variation in populations such as Europeans and Asians are actually subsets of the variation on the African population. And then the site goes on to say that the pattern of DNA variation across populations shows a nested subset. African populations harbor some alleles that are absent in non-African populations. So basically the idea is that the very concept of race is fundamentally nonsensical. The African populations are in fact the populations with gene variations absent from non-African populations. This is because humans first evolved in Africa and then spread into Eurasia after a period of time. Therefore, in a sense, all people are African, their ancestors all originally being from Africa.
So in what ways do anthropologists speak about instances of racism throughout American history, per se?
So, they talk about it in a number of ways, Tyler, but one of the most important points they make lies in the ideas of structure and agency in sociology. See, these terms deal with the causes of racism. Structure has to do with repeated social habits that limit and affect the behavior of individuals, and agency is the ability of individuals to act freely and make their own choices. In her June 2014 article, The Case for Reparations, which was published in The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates discusses the impacts of 250 years of structural racism in the United States. Coates talks about instances of institutional forms of structural racism, such as the racist efforts of the Federal Housing Administration in Chicago and the denial of reparations cases by American judges. Coates also distinguishes personal racism, such as the lynchings common in southern states, especially Mississippi.
Well, that is all very interesting and compelling information, Professor.
Thank you.
Now, how does that information relate to what's going on in the community at and around Washington and Lee?
Well, you see, Tyler, what students at the school are upset about is the lack of recognition the structural racism prevalent in their area receives. Some feel that the school has not been fully mindful of their history and do not fully recognize the impact that African Americans have had on the university throughout its history, including the existence of a hugely impactful donation of slave labor to the university, which you explained earlier. And this is all despite President Ruggiero's recent efforts.
Well, it is really just inspiring that these students are standing up for such serious and relevant issues, just as students are all across the country. To remind viewers, the nationwide movement began at the University of Missouri. The University of Missouri has been playing a very large role in the pivotal movement of racial equality at colleges. Multiple events leading up to the president's resignation on November 9th include the etching of a swastika on a dorm stairwell, a play rehearsal being interrupted by racial slurs, and the final straw when President Wolf chose to ignore the African-American student activists that attempted to block his car during a parade. The students had been trying to get the attention of President Wolf because further action needed to be taken to prevent these racial incidents from occurring again. I'm telling you, Will, for race not actually being biological, it sure is causing a lot of chaos in our society. Well, that's all for tonight, folks. Join us next week for a discussion about how language relates to perception and action.